Hello there, and welcome back, everyone, towards this next workshop. In this next session, I have the great pleasure to be presenting myself, and I'm going to be giving you some more details around one of the very fundamental techniques within service automation, which is the technique of service automation blueprinting. What I'm going to be doing in this session is that I will build upon some of the materials that we shared yesterday. So yesterday, for the people who are just joining for today, we started with giving you an overview of the fact that many service providers are moving towards this world of automated services. And whereas yesterday we discussed the high-level steps on actually why that is necessary, in today's workshop, we're going to be diving in a little bit more detail. We're actually going to look at how do you do this? How do you do this in practice? So I'll be sharing some of the examples of companies where we have done this. And I've also prepared kind of a live demonstration to showcase how you could use this technique by yourself in practice. So I'm really looking forward to this workshop. And as you know by now, throughout the rest of this conference, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box on the right. And then I will moderate those questions towards the end of the session. Good. What I've prepared for today's overview of the workshop is that I'm going to get started with giving you a bit more of a higher level picture. And that is, where do these individual services fit within an enterprise service catalog? Many of you will be familiar with the fact that every organization provides a variety of different services. And those services are typically captured in what is known as a service catalog. So we'll see how the technique of service automation blueprinting will align towards this service catalog and how you can start to define automated service catalogs by yourself. In essence, what we're doing when we're looking at automation is that we're going to see that we can automate different services. And those services need to be managed over time. It's not just enough to automate a service once and then keep it running. You need to maintain that. If systems or updates are changing, you need to update your automations as well. So that means that you will need to take a very structured approach towards the automated services that you have in your catalog itself. And that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be looking at a design methodology so you can keep track of your automated services and how to combine them. So throughout the next few slides, I will walk you through these steps. We're going to start with giving you an overview of the service catalog first. Then we'll look at how automation is changing the essential services in your service catalog. And then we'll walk you through the step-by-step approach on how you can automate services by yourself. Before we start with this, I just want to give you the bigger picture. And the bigger picture to understand is that we are talking about automated services between a service provider, which you see on the left-hand side, and a service consumer, which you see on the right-hand side of the slide. In service automation, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to go through this whole process of value creation between a service provider on the one hand side and the service consumer on the other hand. Based upon these interactions, you will see that value will start to emerge. Think about it this way. If you need anything in your organization, like an IT service or an HR service, you're going to go towards the relevant department. This is where you will be consuming the service. So you're asking for, let's say, an update on a particular document, or you're asking for access towards an application. The service delivery organization, which is typically captured in a shared service center, will subsequently take the steps in order to execute that. And that's when we say that value starts to be created. What we are going to be focusing on in this session is how can we automate this process? So how can the service provider on the left-hand side start to deliver these services automatically towards the service consumer that we see on the right-hand side? And this main model functions for almost every type of service provision. It doesn't matter whether it's IT services, HR services, or even facilities. The concept between a service provider on the one hand side and a service consumer on the other hand actually stays the same. So you can use the same methodology for, let's say, facilities or for IT operations. Doesn't really matter as long as you understand the fundamental concept behind that. And this is also what brings us towards the realization that we would need to manage this. Because in larger organizations, you typically see that the service delivery organization is a very complex network of service relationship. On this slide, you see how those service relationships are being established. It might well be the case that organization C, in this case, consumes services from organization B. But at the same time, organization B might be consuming services from organization A. The main point is that in a modern organization today, we're getting into this complex network of providing services on the one hand side and consuming services on the other. A very good example that illustrates this is if you think about cloud services. Many organizations are using and consuming cloud services on the one hand side, but then are building their own solutions or their own applications on that infrastructure and then providing that towards other forms of the organization. This is what a classical IT organization will do. Service provisioning on the one hand side and service delivery on the other hand. And because, especially in large organizations, this network of services becomes tremendously complex, you would need to keep track of which services you are especially providing. Because if, for instance, organization B delivers an automated service towards organization D, which I'm highlighting right now on the screen, it might well be the case that this service relationship will change its underlying system. And if you have an automation that is running on some of the services that organization B is providing, then your automations might fail or might not be working correctly anymore. So keeping track of which elements are connecting different service providers to service consumers is of crucial importance. And this is a topic that many organizations are struggling with. What I'm always saying is, building an automation once is relatively easy because you will have an actual use case. You can start to work with the systems as they are currently running. But the difficult part comes when you have that automation running for a longer period of time, because the applications are going to be subject to improvements. Think about security patches or new versions or upgrades. And those might directly or indirectly impact the automations that you have in place. So getting towards a system in which you manage and monitor all of those different interactions very carefully is going to be of crucial importance. And you cannot just do that in the technology. You will need to have a design approach in order to do that. And that's exactly the topic that we're going to focus on in today's workshop. In order to relate this back a little bit towards a more traditional IT environment, I've also made 2 or 3 slides which kind of link this back towards the ITIL framework, which is globally considered the best practice standard for IT service management. And one of the very nice aspects that was introduced within the ITIL 4 framework is the concept of a service offering. And a service offering, as we're going to see in the next few slides, is going to match almost perfectly with the whole concept of an automated service catalog. So before I dive into that, and maybe to refresh the memory of the people who have not taken ITIL 4 or have not been involved in that for a long time, let's start with reviewing what a service offering is by looking at the formal definition, which we see here on the screen. A service offering means that we have a description of one or more services, which is designed to address the needs of a target consumer group. So a service offering may include goods, access to resources, and service actions. One of the great ways or analogies I always like to use in order to explain what a service offering is to think about a menu in a restaurant. If you are walking into a restaurant and you would like to order food, the restaurant is going to provide you with a menu. On that menu, you will see different categories like appetizers or main courses or desserts. And on that menu, you see different bundles of services. Within the menu, you don't typically see what are the ingredients that the cook will use in the kitchen. You might see some of the main things, but not exactly the way that it's going to be prepared. And if you think about this, this is a great analogy for a service offering. Because if you are providing IT services or HR services, the people who are going to request your services are not really interested in the way that that whole service is composed. What they're interested in is the menu of the services that you are providing. And this works in exactly the same way for automated services. Because whenever you go towards an online application or a self-service interface, what you're mostly interested in is getting a result towards your service question. However, the provider has structured that, what kind of robots that they have set up in order to deliver that, whether they're using RPA or business process automation, you don't really care about that. What you care about is that if you click a particular button, saying, for instance, I would like to have a test server provisioned, or I would like to have an HR report, is that the process in the backend will run automatically and you will get the results that you're looking for. So basically what we're looking for is how can we set up a service offering from an enterprise point of view, but now not just look at physical services that are going to be conducted by people, but how can we use this to start delivering automated services? And that's the main idea behind service automation blueprinting. How are we going to do that? And if you look at that from a more conceptual manner, we see that what an organization is providing towards customers are services, and that services is being delivered through that service offering that I talked about earlier. The service offering is the menu that a service provider delivers towards the rest of the organization. And it is that service offering that I'm going to focus on a little bit more. With automation, we're going to be making sure that that service offering is going to be delivered in an automated way. And as we've seen in the previous lecture and the previous session that Thomas provided, you can use all kinds of smart technology, automations, and workflows in order to deliver that automated service offering. So Thomas showed robots, which are actually products. He also showed certain workflows and how you can click them together, which are the resources that you would need in order to deliver those automated services. So the picture that you see on the slide is the classic service offerings picture, which is coming from the ITIL 4 framework. And what I've done for this next presentation and for this session is that I just made a very small adjustment, and you can see that appearing on the screen right now. What we're going to be interested in is not just how do we make a service offering that exists today. So how can we bundle our classical services? So think about the main dishes or the desserts, but how can we actually start to deliver a catalog of automated services? How can we manage this besides other service catalogs? And how do we set that up in order to ensure that this is going to be successful? So the main focus of this presentation is going to be how do you set up that automated service offering and how can you manage that in the long run? So let's dive into that a little bit more in detail. And I'm also prepared a particular example so that you can kind of see the journey that you could take in your other organization as well. In order to understand that, let's look at the basic idea of an automated service first. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see the basic way in which a service provider that we've seen a couple of slides ago is delivering services towards a service consumer. So for instance, if you are using a taxi ride through Grab, you are going to be clicking on a couple of buttons and the service provider will execute work in the background. If you're signing up for a training course, you are going to interact with a service provider on some kind of a website. So the way that a service is being delivered very fundamentally is through a number of different steps and interactions. And this is what we're seeing on the slide right here. The person, the user itself, which is depicted in gray at the bottom of this picture, is requesting services back and forth with a service provider. Some of those services are going to be delivered automatically, like for instance, registering for an online event like this conference, or some of these services might be delivered in person, like I'm presenting on this conference now live in this session. So note that automated services does not mean that you're eliminating all of the human aspects. It's still perfectly fine that some steps in your automated process are done in a manual fashion. In the previous session from Thomas, he also noted this. He said that, for instance, if you would need to key in some kind of a token that you would need to generate for security purposes, then it's perfectly fine if that step is manual. Also think if you're booking a taxi through Grab, the fact that you still need to get into a car and that the driver needs to bring you from point A to point B is still a manual action, and that's perfectly fine. In this conference, a lot of the interaction is going automatically, but still the lectures and the presentations are done by live speakers, which is also perfectly fine as part of an automated service. What is important to note is that the steps that are being taken to move and deliver a service is in almost all cases sequential. And that's what I'm highlighting on the screen right now. So if you think about that a little bit more deeply, you will see that a service is nothing else than a number of sequential steps that are being delivered. And in traditional service organizations, these steps and these interactions between the service provider and the service consumer are done in a manual way. So for instance, somebody sends an email in order to answer a question, or somebody generates a quotation in order to send to a customer. Many of these steps in most organizations today are still done completely manually, and that's perfectly fine. But what we're interested in automated services is, can we not automate those steps completely? And that is basically the step that we're making from the traditional organization on the left towards the organization that we're seeing on the right. So for every interaction, and an interaction is just a way of communication between a user and the service provider, we're going to look at whether we can automate that step. So what we're basically doing is we're placing a layer between the service provider that we're seeing right here and the user that we're seeing right here. And that layer in the middle is going to be facilitated through the self-service portal. The self-service portals are going to be illustrated in our next upcoming presentation by Summit AI. So I'm not going to focus too much around that. What I'm going to focus on is what are the process steps and that you can take in order to have this as part of a service that you want to deliver. So moving from traditional service delivery towards automated service delivery is done by making this particular step. What we're actually doing, as you see appearing right now on the screen, is that we're putting this self-service portal between the user and the service delivery organization. So this is done through IT self-service portals. It can be done through HR self-service portals, but even also for finance, operations, facilities, you can start to design different self-service portals. And again, we're going to see some great examples of that in the next upcoming presentation from Summit AI. However, in that self-service portal, we need to make services available. And those services need to be managed. And this is where, again, I'm going to come back towards the service offering that I introduced on the last slide. So moving from the situation to the left towards the situation on the right is basically the process that we call service automation. Looking at your traditional services and transforming them into an automated delivery option. And the way that we have, or that we are advocating for, is to use a framework to do that. And this is known as the service automation framework, which you see in the middle. So the picture that you see right here. And that was also introduced by Nick in the lecture from yesterday. So with the service automation framework, you find a structured and an approach in order to go through all of these steps. In the session that I prepared today, we won't go into this in too much detail, but I've done quite a number of videos on this on the online platform. So if you are interested in this, go to the YouTube page and download some of the videos or watch some of the service automation videos itself. It will give you an overview of the steps that are being taken to do this. Good. So that service automation framework is basically a fast track approach on how do you move from analog towards automated services in a step-by-step approach. And you actually see that it consists of 6 major domains. We're defining a self-service portal around a user, and the design needs to be based upon those user interactions that we've seen on the previous slide. We obviously need a layer of technology to support that, which is going to be the self-service portal. But the most important part in the back end is to have processes running. Because if somebody clicks on a button on a self-service portal and there's no process running in the background, the workflow will not be triggered and the value will not be delivered. So thinking from a service provider's point of view, which processes do I need and how do I set them up is going to be of crucial importance. What I will do in the next few slides is I'm going to show you exactly what those steps will be. So how you can do that yourself. And we'll also look at a live example of an actual use case that we've worked on in the past. Good. So note that all of these services ultimately are going to be made available through self-service portals. And even though you see that in this conference, we're focusing quite a lot around automation, especially from a more IT perspective with RPA, note that automated services can also be delivered for a variety of different industries. I also already mentioned before things like facilities. It's perfectly well possible to automate these kinds of services. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see an example of HR services, which are, for instance, looking at your travel or booking your vacation days, asking for your time off, or looking at other kinds of resumes or some kind of a historical overview. All of these are examples of self-service portals, and we're seeing more of these self-service interfaces coming up every single year. Reason for that is that people actually like to use these self-service portals because we have become so accustomed to using these kinds of services through apps on our mobile phones and looking at the way to easily interact and request for services. Examples of what we've seen yesterday, especially in the session where we started how to create these kinds of applications in less than a couple of minutes, are supporting this development. And we've seen in also one of the previous presentations that the expectation is that within the next 2 to 3 years, there will be 2 times as more of these applications created as that there currently exist in the world. So we will see more of these automated self-service portals. And what I would strongly encourage you to do is start thinking about the services that your organization is providing. Which services would you be able to make available automatically? And how could you interact with your users in order to deliver those services automatically? Because I will promise you that if you figure out how to make that transition, it will not only help you with your digital transformation journey, it's also going to greatly expand your reach towards different customers and at the same time have way better control over where improvements can be made. So let's look at a particular automation example in practice. And I'm going to be using an example which is purposely non-IT related to kind of showcase you that service automation can be used in a variety of different industries. And as most of you will know, because I mentioned it in the introduction, I'm originally Dutch. So even though I've been living in Kuala Lumpur for the last 5 years, I've actually coming from the city of Amsterdam, which is located in a very tiny country, which is called the Netherlands. And for that reason, when I was still living there 7 or 8 years ago, I became involved with the first type of service automation project. And this was the automation of government services. So if you think about what a government actually does, is that besides making all kinds of laws and rules and regulations, is that they are also providing services to citizens. So if you need to have a new parking permit, if you would need to register for immigration, if you need to get a new passport, driver's license, identification card, what you will do is you will need to get into contact with the local government, in this case, the city of Amsterdam. And if you think about that a little bit more in detail, basically what the government is providing is different types of services. And on this slide, you see that this has been nicely categorized into a number of categories on the slide. Basically, what you're seeing on this slide is already a self-service portal. It is a way to interact with a service provider, in this case, the city of Amsterdam, as a particular user, and in this case, that would be you as a citizen. And in this example, basically what we're seeing is that through this self-service portal, you are able to connect to the government and get access to a variety of different services in the backend. And what I want you to very closely see, and this is a crucial aspect to think about, is that based upon this entry point on this self-service portal, basically what you're doing is you're accessing different service catalogs. So if I go back one section, is that we have a service catalog for parking services. We will have a different service catalog for waste and recycling. We have a different service catalog for job management. Same is true for immigration, contact information, civil affairs, moving to or within Amsterdam, and City Hall. So technically speaking, and from an automation point of view, these are all different automated service catalogs. And this is the way that you would need to set it up and design it, because the processes that are going to be triggered in the backend are going to be involving different systems. And I think you might very easily see that, for instance, parking services that I've just shown are going to be completely different than, for instance, civil affairs. They will need to integrate with different databases. They will need to integrate with different other systems that are going to be proprietary or specific towards a different department. It might even be the case that parking is managed by a completely different entity than, for instance, civil affairs. So by setting up these different automated service catalogs and dividing them into these different individual service catalogs, you can also start assigning roles and responsibilities accordingly. So making different people responsible for different service catalogs. And it's this very fundamental way of organizing your automated services that is going to be very crucial for the maintenance. Because if a change needs to be made towards, let's say, parking policies, you don't want that to impact all of your other services. And that's a really crucial thing to think about. If we dive into that a little bit more in detail, I'm going to be taking one of those service catalogs, and then we're going to be looking at the individual services that are part of that service catalog. So how do you build that? Well, there's basically a very simple 5-step approach. So what we're going to be doing first is that we're going to be looking at how do we define a service from a user point of view. Then we're going to categorize these into the different service catalogs, as I've just shown on the previous slide. And then we're going to get towards the main topic, and that is service automation blueprinting. So for each of the individual services that are part of our service catalog, we're going to be composing a service automation blueprint. And I'll come back towards that in a second. And then as soon as we have that service automation blueprint ready, we can start with designing the workflows and scripts. And this is where RPA is going to come in, as Thomas mentioned earlier in his presentation. We can look at individual steps like transferring data between different systems, making reports, sending messages, etc. And then the last step to really truly make it an automated service is that we would need to make this available through the self-service portal. So let's run through these steps a little bit more in detail. For the first 2 steps, the first thing that we're going to be doing is to build those individual service catalogs. And those service catalogs are nothing else than a logical combination of the different categories of services. So on the website that I showed in the previous few slides ago, you see that we have a different service catalog for civil affairs, we have a different service catalog for local business, and we have a different service catalog, in this case, for education affairs. Each of those service catalogs will contain a number of automated services, but is going to be managed by different entities, using different IT systems and different databases that are going to be catering towards this. So this is an example of the city of Amsterdam, but we're going to dive into one of those individually. And the example that I have selected for today's session is to specifically focus on the service blueprint for this particular service. So in this case, it's going to be applying for a passport through this self-service portal. And the way that we're going to be doing that is by creating this service automation blueprint. And to kind of start with the end in mind, so to kind of give you an overview first of what a completed service automation blueprint looks like, I will start with showcasing you the end result. So this end result is basically the process that will subsequently need to be put into the RPA solution or into the script. But from a design perspective and from a design point of view, it's important that you make this step first. Because if for whatever reason something changes, you know exactly which steps in your blueprint are going to be affected. So let me run you very briefly through that and very quickly through that. At the top of the slide, and before I do that, I first need to give you a quick overview of what a service automation blueprint looks like. So the good news is that service automation blueprints are available for free. So what I hope that after this session, you will be inspired to do is to download this blueprint by yourself. I also will show you how you can make this into a workable solution. But a service automation blueprint basically consists of 5 layers. And what a service automation blueprint is going to very deliberately do, and I'll just move back towards the previous slide, is that we're going to be separating the work that is going to be done by the user and separate that work by the work that is going to be done by the service provider. And the service provider will start to deliver those automated services that we will see in the layer below. And the way that we're going to separate that is through that self-service portal that we see as the layer in the middle. This is the basic design of a service automation blueprint. And this forces you to think about how can we interact between a user and a service provider in a way that there is always this portal in the middle. Because in the end, in an automated service, you would need to have this differentiation and interact through that portal in the middle. So this approach will help you to set this up. On the next slide, you see these layers of the service automation blueprint explained in a little bit more detail. This is just for your reference and after we've shared the slides after this particular session. But note that there's quite a lot of explanation on that on the different articles and videos that you can find online. What I'm mostly going to be interested in today's presentation is to showcase you how it actually works. And this is based on an actual use case. So in this example, and I already kind of gave away that this is the city of Amsterdam, we were invited to automate citizen services through that self-service portal. And to kind of give you an idea of the volume, there were 203,113 annual passport requests per year. So you can see that the workload and the repetitiveness of this particular portal is quite significant. So let's see how that would work in practice. So what we first start with is the layer that we see on top. And that layer is known as the user actions. Very simply stated, the user actions are the customer journey that a user is walking through. So from a user perspective, basically you would like to have 3 steps. You want to first of all request for a new passport through the portal. Then after a certain amount of time, you would like to receive a notification that your new passport is ready. And then the last step is that you would need to collect your passport. In this case, also note that there are some deliberate manual steps still in this automated process. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, it's perfectly fine to incorporate manual steps. In this particular use case, these manual steps were necessary from a legal perspective, because it needs, especially in the Netherlands, you would need to pick up your passport in person so that there is an identification verification, which is just a legal requirement. So from a very high level, those are the 3 steps that you're going to go through from a user perspective. The second key step is that you would need to think about how are we going to communicate back towards our users. And in the service automation blueprinting approach, we are referring to this as physical evidence. Physical evidence will generate trust with users that a service is actually being delivered. So for instance, the moment that you have submitted a request for a new passport, you would like to receive an email that is giving you a confirmation around your request. This is a very important point, because if you as a user don't get this form of confirmation, then you probably won't know that something is actually happening in the backend. The same is true for whenever your passport is ready. So you would like to get a pickup date. In this case, we use the QR code to get a notification that you can pick up your passport. All of these need ultimately to be programmed into your self-service solution so that these emails are going to be automatically generated. I see that a lot of people are in backend are downloading the service automation blueprint, so that's why you sometimes hear a little bit of a ping. So this is the user's perspective. As I mentioned earlier, this is all what happens at the user side. The next key step is that we then need to think about the design of the self-service portal. And again, I'm not going to go into that too much detail, because in the next presentation, which will start at 11, we're going to see some great examples of self-service portals. But you would need to have some kind of an interface. This can be an app, but preferentially a self-service portal in which you can automate some of the workflows in the backend. The next and major important step is that we then start to think about which processes do we need from a service provider point of view. And these processes are happening at the backend. So in this particular case, and note that for the sake of this presentation, I've kind of simplified the slide a little bit. The real example is slightly more complex, but for the sake of time, I've made it into 3 main steps. The first process is an identity validation and confirmation process. And again, this was required from a legal perspective so that there is a verification that the person that is actually asking for the passport is the person that is supposed to be receiving the passport, because otherwise there might be kind of fraudulent activities going on. So this identity validation and confirmation process was actually designed to be an automated process, and we used an RPA solution to actually design this. If this identity validation and confirmation process was not passed, then you see that it automatically went towards the immigration department for manual processing. But suppose that the validation was done automatically and there was a system in place to do that. In the Netherlands, that's called a digital identification. If that test is passed, then the passport will be produced. The passport production process is again an automated process. Basically, it means that a work order needs to be sent towards the production company that is making the passports, which is what you're seeing right here. But also, the moment that that work order has been produced, you can start to send back a message towards the user saying the work order has been placed and we expect that the passport has been produced and is ready for you, let's say 5 days from now. So that's when the email is issued with the date that you can pick up your passport as well as the location. So after that, it is going back towards the user again, and the user is then collecting the passport. There's again a new process that is done automatically to verify that this is the person, and we use the QR code in order to do that. And that passport still needed to be picked up in person at the city council desk of the city of Amsterdam. So after that passport release process has been completed, once again, it was logged that the passport was collected, and you once again received an email that the passport has been adequately collected, so that in case you didn't collect the passport yourself, then you might immediately see that something is wrong if that's the case. So from an automation perspective and from a blueprinting perspective, these 3 processes that I've highlighted into this layer are of crucial importance, because these are the automated processes that we would need to design. And I get asked the question many times, what is the difference between service automation and RPA? And the difference is actually quite straightforward, because when we look at service automation in itself, we look at the entire process all the way from the beginning towards the end. So service automation focuses on the complete experience. Where does RPA come in? Well, RPA is very suitable and it must or should be used to automate individual processes. So if we look at the domain of RPA, we see that we're using RPA to automate these individual processes which are part of your automated journey. And that's a crucial thing also to understand. And the service automation blueprint will immediately help you to define the entire customer journey, but also look at which processes you would then need to automate. And for instance, if this database changes, you will know exactly that this automation is going to be impacted by that. So creating this service automation blueprint will then help you to start managing those services over longer periods of time. And what I always strongly believe in is that you need to make a very good design up front, and then you can start to build these things by yourself. So moving towards some of the key benefits of the blueprint, basically what this blueprinting approach shows you, as I've hopefully explained well in the previous few slides, is what is the overview of your automated service. And the blueprint, by using this template, forces you to separate the user actions and the processes that are being delivered by a service provider through that single self-service portal that we've been talking about so far. So that blueprint really then gives you an overview of all of the technical connections as well as the interactions that you would need to design into your script, and how you should be designing your RPA solutions and your individual automations, but always doing that from a bigger picture, from a higher level of perspective. And that's a really crucial thing as well, because that will showcase if some kind of technology changes, how can we update the blueprint and which automations are then going to be affected immediately. So to kind of summarize what we've been going through so far, those last blueprints are then going to be made available through the self-service portal individually. And that is really the last step. The last key thing that you would then need to do is to start facilitating the active use. So you need to make people familiar that these automated services exist, and you would need to encourage them to start logging in towards these self-service portals. So in summary, I hope that you kind of see the bigger picture and that you see how service automation blueprints are used. The high-level approach is that you compose your service catalog first, your catalog of automated services. Then for each individual service, you're building an automated blueprint. And then for each blueprint, you're making the service available through some kind of a self-service portal. And in this case, it can be for any kind of service that you can think about. So the example here that is from the city of Amsterdam. So this concludes our brief workshop on how to compose service automation blueprints. I would like to open up now for questions. I've seen some questions coming in. We still have a couple of minutes left to do that. Good. First key thing that I would like to answer is the question that is coming from Mohammed Hasri. And he is saying, is there a method, best practice on how we can measure the effectiveness of automation we have introduced in the process or service? And the answer to this question is absolutely yes, because as soon as you have made those processes available, you can start to see the metrics. And I always call these engagement metrics, because they will showcase to you how people are actually using and consuming these services in the long run. So that's a very important element to think about. The next question is from an anonymous attendee, so I'll put it on the screen. This framework can be useful for automation projects. Where can we learn more about the framework? So the framework is called Service Automation Framework. if you just Google that, you will be brought towards a page where you can download all of the information around that. So I hope that that answers the question as well. I see one more interesting question coming in, so let me open. That question is going to be from Kumar. How do you manage changes in the automation process? So that's a very great question, Kumar, is that you would need to think about a change management process. So what we're actually doing that, and I didn't cover that a lot into today's lecture, is that we're also, as soon as we're making a change towards a service automation blueprint, is that we're doing that through a formal change process. So in practice, you would like to version your different blueprints so that you will always know what is the latest and the most active blueprint in question. And that's going to be the most important part from a change management perspective. So kind of hope that that answers your question as well. Good. We're almost out of time. So let me quickly showcase what is coming up next. Good. So you just listened to me talk a lot about automation and automated blueprints. And I mentioned already a couple of times that a self-service portal is a crucial element in automation itself. And in our next upcoming session, we're going to look in more detail, specifically at how do you set up these kinds of self-service portals. So I would all like to invite and welcome you back towards the next session, which will start at 11 o'clock, where Dev and Madhur are going to showcase us how do you set up these self-service portals. I hope you found this workshop useful. And again, if you have any additional questions around blueprints, please feel free to reach out to me after the conference itself. Thanks again, everyone, for your kind attention, and see you back again in the next session.